Hi, everyone. My name is Davis McCallum. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the artistic director at the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. I'm zooming in from our administrative offices, which are located in the heart of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape, Munsee, and Wappinger people in what is colonially known as Phillipstown, New York. Welcome to tonight's third installment of our series called Wednesdays With. We have a very special guest, Ann Washburn, here today. But before I bring Ann into the Zoom, I want to share with you just a little bit of news. If you're on this Zoom, you know that this coming season you're likely to know that this coming season is going to be our first in our permanent home. For the last 35 years, we've been performing at Boscobel House and Gardens, and thanks to an incredible gift from Chris Davis, we're moving to a 98-acre campus just down the road in Garrison. And I think my colleague Emily Casey is showing a picture of the incredible view of the Hudson River that you have from this incredible piece of property, which will soon be coming to HVSF. There's also a site plan here, which I think we can share with you, which shows where in this coming summer in 2022, and in all likelihood in 2023, where we'll be putting up our current tent, a demountable tent that we put up every year at Boscobel. We're able to put it up in a new location at the Garrison. And that's thanks to a special event permit by the town of Phillipstown. This is going to be a great place for our tent to go up. It fits very snugly on what was a former tennis court pad many years ago. And it's immediately adjacent to the large clubhouse building at the Garrison, which means for the first time in Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival's history, our actors will have an indoor place to put on their costumes before they get on stage. And immediately to the south of where you see that tent icon is a beautiful sloping lawn that'll be perfect for pre-show picnics, which has become such a tradition with our audiences. I should also say that we're excited about the partnership with the Valley Restaurant, which is in that large building you see immediately to the left of the tent. So if you're not psyched about having a picnic on a lawn, you can come early and have a dinner at the Valley Restaurant before the show. And on certain nights, the bar will be open after the show, which is a real added benefit for theater people everywhere and theater fans. So without further ado, I want to announce our special guest for tonight, who is the playwright Ann Washburn. Hi, Ann.
Hi.
Without embarrassing you, Emily, I'm getting a little reverb. Without you too, and you've been an artist for a long time, and I'm so pleased to be directing your play, Mr. Burns, somewhere. So I have all sorts of questions for you. Maybe we'll have to figure out how to mutually mute. Are you hearing any kind of feedback when I talk?
No.
Oh, okay. Emily's saying I think we're good. And now the reverb is gone. So thank you for bearing with us as we have a little technical difficulties working on our StreamYard. And you and I have kind of been in each other's orbit for many years at Club Thumb and at Humana. And I know that you spent, well, before we get to talk about Mr. Burns, I'd love to talk to you just about, kind of your body of work and your approach as a playwright. You have spent the afternoon with our mutual friend, Maria Stryer, talking about Club Thumb, right?
Yeah, I'm in the offices next door of Ryder Farm. So I've just come straight from that meeting into this. Yes.
Amazing. Well, so tell us about how you got started as a playwright, or kind of how you found yourself in the, in the profession of playwriting as a calling and as a career. I'm thinking about Club Thumb's mission and funny, strange, and provocative plays, which feels very much like descriptors that might be attached to your body of work as well.
I mean, the way I sort of describe it is that I was a kid who loved theater very much. And I also wrote things. I wrote poetry. And it never felt like the poetry was quite right. And I was going to give up all of it when I went to college. I didn't think of playwriting as something that one did. I thought it was something that had happened in the past. I went to schools which had kind of conservative drama programs. And then somehow, when I got to college, one of the seniors had done a play for his thesis, which was this kind of insane mashup of Beckett and maybe Beckett and Albee and the Greeks and Pinter, heavy Pinter influence. And it was just this lunatic thing, and I had never seen the like. The fact that some living person had made this play happen was very exciting and inspiring to me. And I ended up accidentally writing a weird little playlet for the midnight theater thing we had at the college, actually to get his attention, with a satire of his play. And that somehow started. And I spent a lot of time after undergraduate in Seattle, which at the time had a really burgeoning new play scene, and that was exciting. But I wasn't going to be a playwright because that was crazy, because you couldn't really make a living at it in any way.
Were you roughly contemporary with Adam Greenfield and Heidi Schreck and other folks who are now colleagues of yours in New York City?
I was kind of I was there just as Annex Theater had started up, so those guys came a couple years after that, but I met them all. They had this Bonanza Festival they would host so later, I think when I was like somewhere in the mid 90s, they all coalesced in Seattle, had this kind of great theater company, did this thing called the Bonanza Festival. They would solicit plays from playwrights across the country. They would ship you out to Seattle, put you up on somebody's couch, drink you under the table, and do these kick-ass readings of your work. So I met those guys then. And I think you and didn't we first meet in the Soho Rep Writer Director Lab?
Yes. Oh my God, that's right. I had forgotten that. And you were doing Communist Dracula pageant, or developing that in that lab. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I don't know whether that was before or after the ladies at the Civilians.
That was before. I don't remember who my official director was at the lab. I was doing this play called Communist Dracula Pageant, which was about the fall of the Ceausescus during the Romanian Revolution of 91. I don't remember who my director was, but they had to pull out. They got some kind of a gig. So then Steve Cosson filled in for the reading. And then the Civilians were just starting 2 weeks later. They had the first so I got pulled into that. So that's how I became the Civilians. And I think actually Annie Kaufman, yes, who I also met in the Writer Director Lab, and I had already started the ladies right around that time. I guess the two were contemporaneous. So that somehow became the Civilians project. It was all this sort of mush at the time of meeting people and doing things with different people. And
I remember that moment, and it was so exciting because I already knew and loved Michael Friedman, and he collaborated with you and Annie on that production of the ladies, right?
He did. Yeah.
And that kind of coalesced this group of artists that really kind of became the theater company, the Civilians, right? I mean, it was Canard, Goose, and the ladies in that first year of the Civilians. And I was saying to the designers of Mr. Burns, like, that the first act of Mr. Burns is a bunch of people who end up kind of thrown together around the campfire, and something happens in the last couple of pages of that first act when they sing, they sing the bit from Gilbert and Sullivan, and Gibson kind of steps forward and says, actually, I know all that music and I'm happy to sing it for you. You don't have to ask me twice. Like some electricity happens, which means that 7 years later, that group is largely still together. It's almost like we're witnessing the birth of a theater company right there at the end of the first act. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because it seems like the same kind of crystallization was happening right around those two projects and when the Civilians were born. Do you think that's true?
I remember that as being a really fertile time for a lot of people. I mean, it was a time when New York was rather less, I mean, it seems crazy because it seemed super expensive then, but a lot of people were making strange stuff kind of under, below 42nd Street. There were a lot of alternative spaces. It just really felt like a lot was going on. And it felt like, we all sort of, what I remember is, there were very few opportunities if you were an early career artist. Like now there are a lot of stepping stones between early career artist and sort of non-traditional artist. And, big theaters will have secondary spaces where you can kind of see more experimental work. And that didn't really exist at the time. So the way I remember it is we would all get together at bars and just complain bitterly. But I had a young writer, at the time a young writer, now a very established writer, said to me some years ago that he was from the generation that kind of came after us. So, started, I don't know, like 7 years later, 7 or 8 years later, that they kind of envied our camaraderie, that they had so many opportunities that they were a little bit more, a little bit more aloof with each other. They were a little bit more independent, a little bit more, kind of doing things. And we had nothing to go for. We only had each other and an audience. So we did have this great feeling of being all together in an odd way, practicing this art that we really loved in a way that we really enjoyed, that was not recognized by the rest of the world in any way, shape, or form. As I remember it, I felt like we were each other's accolades and each other's.
Hey, I want to talk about that more. Do you teach now? I was trying to Google just before we got on this Zoom to be like, is Anne teaching at a MFA program someplace? I thought I knew that, but I couldn't verify that using the internet. Is it true?
I teach sometimes. I teach sometimes. I have I'm not great with boundaries as a teacher. So when I teach, I write a lot less. So although I
thought you meant boundaries and giving feedback to people's plays, but I'm sure you're very appropriate in dealing with students. You mean your teaching becomes all of your focus, and your playwriting has to kind of move aside to make space for teaching. Is that what you mean?
It does a little bit. I think teaching playwriting takes up a lot of the same bandwidth as writing plays. So although teaching is very enjoyable and a super challenge, and I do enjoy doing it, but I try to not do it back to back.
Right.
So I taught graduate students during the pandemic last spring.
Oh.
So wonderful and horrible at the same time.
Yeah. Well, you just said, there was a moment when people were pursuing projects because they just loved them, and the eccentricity of those projects didn't count against them. In fact, they were kind of counted in their favor. And, I wonder if you could share a little bit about the origin of Mr. Burns, because I read somewhere that, there was a workshop where you were in the bottom of a bank building somewhere in the financial district with Steve and a bunch of actors, and somehow you challenged them with remembering, an episode of The Simpsons, and that was part of the origin story of the play. And maybe in a kind of game of telephone, I've misremembered that or said it the wrong way, but that seems appropriate to a play like Mr. Burns. Maybe you can help clarify. What is the origin story?
The origin of it was that I had this idea for years. I think it was an idea I started brooding about in subways after 9/11 in New York. For me, weirdly, Mr. Burns is kind of a 9/11 play, although I didn't actually sit down to write it till 2010. But as you will remember from that time, it felt very precarious to be in New York. It felt as though surely there would be another attack. It was odd to remain in the city in a way. And I think because apocalyptic musings are soothing in a tense moment, a sort of little, I would often kind of just sort of muse about, what if the apocalypse were to happen? and what would people do? They would tell stories around campfires just because that's what people do. What are the stories everyone has in common? They're television. And I liked to just sort of think about what would happen with these stories as, the era of electricity and television has ended. Like, how would they be told right after the event? Which stories would be told? And how would that how would that move forward in time? How would they change if those were our starter set of stories? And I don't remember quite how I ended up with The Simpsons, because I was thinking you would tell cheery stories right off the apocalypse. You'd want to make each other laugh because you'd be such a wreck. So I was thinking about Cheers, and I was thinking about Seinfeld, and I was thinking about Friends, and I sort of hit on The Simpsons. And I knew that to make the play, the only thing I really knew about it, apart from the 3-act structure and the fact that the last act was highly musical, and set far in the future, I knew that I wanted it to be a group of people trying to capture, trying to remember something. And that language that we have around remembering is so complicated. Do you know what I mean? And I didn't think I was quite a good enough writer to capture it. Or maybe it was just an excuse to not write, which is, you'll seize anything to not go forward with an idea. So I had this idea, and I thought, well, I really want to start it by sitting down with a group of writers in a room. Not writers, actors in a room. And I want to task them with remembering Simpsons episodes, and whichever one they remember, I'll go from that. That seemed like a really interesting challenge. But I didn't know how long it would take. And I sort of felt like I can drag my friends, the actors, into a room for a day, maybe 2 days for free, but not more than that. That would be an imposition. I mean, thinking very much like a woman, honestly, in this way. I don't want to bother anyone with my idea. Until Steve came to me, Steve Costin of the Civilians came to me. He had a commissioning grant that they were going to apply for.
Oh, so wait, you had the idea, but you weren't ready to get everybody in the room until Steve came to you and said, you had mentioned this idea to me. Is that right?
No. He said, do you want to apply for a grant with us? And I said, oh, what about this idea? And he said, okay. We got the grant. And then we had the time and the space and sort of the a good excuse to get together in a room. And yes, one of the free rooms which was going around that summer as a rehearsal space was a bank vault deep underneath Wall Street. It was this crazy thing where you went in the lobby and you went through 3 different kinds of security, and then you went down a stairwell and then another stairwell and then an elevator, and you got to the bottom, and they had to put up little directional signs with arrows to take you through this winding set of corridors, which were completely deserted. And at the end of it, there was an ex-bank vault, which was a very ordinary room with one of those enormous, scary doors, and no cell service, which was perfect. So we were kind of stranded down there in a way, and it felt rather like being trapped, and it felt like you could have an apocalypse happen above you and no one would know. And so, yes, we started by doing improv. We're like, okay, everybody's around a campfire and it's after the apocalypse, and what are the kind of things you would say to each other? And the Civilians actors are amazing, but improv is a really specific skill set, which none of us had. So we did this very embarrassing improv for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then everyone was too embarrassed. So we're like, all right, just try to tell a Simpsons episode that you remember. And so they kind of hacked at it for a couple of hours and then settled on Cape Fear. And I recorded it. And then we had the one who had the best recall of all of them, Matt Mayer, for whom the character Matt, we had him step back. And Jenny and Maria, who had pretty good recall, they sort of pieced the story together, remembering new details and also making them up, because the sort of injunction we gave them was, you should do this the way you would do it in the wild, which is that if you were telling a good story and you couldn't remember what came next, you'd make something up just to make it go along. So they made stuff up. And then we had them step aside and had the remaining, group tell. So we had 3 different versions of it with varying degrees of accuracy, and also people remembering more as they went along. And I took those 3 versions. This was in 2008. And then I sat on it for 2 years because I didn't think this was a play. I didn't know what it was going to be. But I was like, no, I don't. I mean, I think this is, I don't think anyone's going to make this. I just didn't think it was going to happen. So until 2010 that Steve Costin really began getting on my case, that I sat down and wrote it pretty quickly.
And you knew that the third act was musicalized far into the future. Did you know kind of what the second act would kind of frame around?
No, I didn't know. Yeah, I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know how the second act would. The second act originally, actually, I had forgotten this, and someone reminded me the other day. The first act, we see everyone sitting around a campfire telling a Simpsons story, and then
That's
I don't
good.
think
You can help folks who might be watching this Zoom who don't know the play quite as well as you or I do. The first act, go for it.
Sorry, all right, correct, yeah, and guide me if in the first act, civilization has just fallen, and we see a group of people who may or may not know each other well, it's unclear, entertaining each other by recounting a Simpsons episode. So everything is just sort of gone nuts. They found a campfire they've made somewhere not too far away from civilization, and they're just trying to keep each other entertained and calm. And
I think based on the evidence in the text, it might be somewhere in the Hudson Valley, this campfire, because somebody says they went across 84 and they're X number of miles from Indian Point. And when I was reading the play, I was kind of like, that's got to be within 20 miles of the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. So it's almost site specific. Yeah.
I mean, I worked it out with little maps and things in the day, and I can't remember.
I've traced your work on Google Maps, a decade later, and it's very accurate. It all checks out, dramaturgically appropriate in every respect.
All right, that's awesome. If you need to do something to get it smack there, you're welcome to do so.
Okay.
Let's talk about it because the language is specific. But, and then the second act was originally that same Simpsons episode, which they've been recounting. It's them performing it. So that was the entire second act. And it's changed, and it's become rather extreme, and it's become much more extensive of a story. So that was the second act, which I really enjoyed. But as Steve Cosson pointed out, it was totally actionable. So I had to scrap it entirely.
Right.
And then reformulate the second act as it is now. And then I always knew that the third act would be somewhere between Greek theater and Victorian melodrama, just out of the assumption that in an odd way, the story of the play is what happens if theater is made by people without theater experience, like, instinctively. And there's something about to have theater, much of the theater that we practice now is, we have musicals where you have songs and dance. And then you have, straight theater, and it may be comic and it may be serious, but it's, very seldom is there much in the way of song. Very seldom is there much in the way of dance. It's sort of, it's discussion and action, which is unusual in the history of theater. In almost every culture throughout all of time, theater has been something which was everything all at once. So it seems to me that in this future, if people didn't know that that it shouldn't be everything all at once, it would be everything all at once. There would be no reason for it not to be.
Well, I mean, maybe that's a good frame for thinking about the kind of theater that you're attracted to. Do you think everything all at once is it? I mean, it seems to me, knowing, 10 of your plays, that each one feels like it's a formal invention too. I remember the play Devil at Noon that you did at Humana the year that I was there with Molly Metzler, where you had a whole kind of kitchen scene with no kitchen and no props. Everyone was miming all their props, but it was so meticulously orchestrated that after watching it for 20 minutes, you had a really clear idea of everything that was in the kitchen. Like, people would forget things and have to go back across to pick up the thing, and you would know exactly what it was they were picking up. I mean, is that part of the game that you play with yourself as a playwright? Is like, how will we figure this out? Is this even possible in the theater? Because it seems like you're always kind of breaking new ground in one way or another. I
mean, it isn't deliberate. I will say that I think that a lot of my plays have really, that play especially, like the fact that you you could see the kitchen after they'd spent time in it is testament to the miracle, which is actors, right? Something that often happens is I have on more than one occasion written a play where I'm like, I think this is great, but you'll never get actors to do this. This presents too many challenges, too many horrible, horrific challenges. So I have a play with many long sections and a made up foreign language. I'm like, you can't ask actors to memorize that. That's nuts. But what I have kind of discovered time and again is that actors really enjoy, many actors really enjoy a crazy challenge. And there is something really pleasurable, I think, just on some bioenergetic level, about seeing an actor approach and rise to a crazy challenge. Mm-hmm. Which I guess doesn't speak so much to how I write them, except maybe somewhere in the back of my mind, because I was a young actor for some period of time. Some part of me is like, oh, give me some really tough part. I think it's just that theater is kind of a form with enormous potential, and a play script, it's not a fixed literary work. It's in many ways a blueprint with enormous potential to be informed by the talents and capacities of the actors, the director, the designers. Do you know what I mean? Like there's just so many things it can do. We've in some ways only really scratched the surface of it. Mm-hmm. So I feel like some of it is just trying to I don't know, there's just a lot more. So I'm sort of sometimes I think I'm trying to find just some other corner of it that I haven't quite seen before, which I think is honestly what every playwright does. Like you don't write a play. I think when you start writing plays, maybe you write plays that look like plays you've seen. You want to write a play, but at some point you're writing the plays you haven't seen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I want to take us back to Mr. Burns a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to collaborate with our mutual friend who's no longer with us, Michael Friedman? When you and I spoke about this play, I think I confessed to you that one of the things that draws me to it most is the collaboration that you and Michael had on the third act. And here's a picture of him. That it strikes me that the reason to do the play, particularly in 2022, is the emotional payoff of the third act, and maybe that resonates in a slightly different way now than it did pre-pandemic. So we'll talk about how the play's resonance has changed lately. But before we do that, what was it like to work with Michael on that third act? How did you guys start to wrap your head around what theater might be like 75 years into the future, what it might sound like, and what the music theater vocabulary would or could or should be?
I mean, part of it is that when I said I wrote it quickly, I wrote the first and second act once I readjusted the second act, the first and second act they're not as they were in the first draft. They, have been reworked a ton. But the third act was really sketchy. Because it wasn't so much, it wasn't musical theater, but it was musical drama. And what was that? And I had no experience really writing that. So the way that I write, prose scenes is I kind of just listen to what the characters want to say. And it tends to be, people don't state their motivations in life, right? Ever. They're always, if they seem to be stating their motivations, you really have to watch out, because that's not going to be their motivation. Like we're whatever. So, I was trying to approach the story of the third act kind of indirectly, and it doesn't work that way at all with music. I had no idea. You have to really go for it in a straight ahead way. So it took a long time to go from the kind of nascent version of Act 3 to the version of Act 3 that we have now. And Michael, apart from being, a genius composer, was really the finest dramaturg I have ever met. And I've met some really good dramaturgs. And what made him kind of especially genius, I don't know how he did it. He was so smart. And I'm sure that he was, he would be looking at this and thinking, well, what you need to do, quite obviously, is this. Like, this has to happen. There has to be this kind of a song to get to this kind of place, which I know you're trying to do. And he wouldn't say, well, this is what you need to do. He would ask a question or two, and they would be really simple questions and kind of obvious questions. But there was just something about how he levered them in. And I'd say, well, and then I'd have some sort of moment, and then I'd go off and write something, which I'm pretty confident was exactly what he wanted me to write in the first place. But because I had somehow come to it on my own, it's just more vital when you do that. So he just had this incredibly generous, attentive, delicate way of approaching it. It was also many, many drafts, that third act. It took us a long time.
And just because it'll help me in directing it, how did it change? It got sharper, more direct, more refined, more essentialized. I mean, I know that Burns comes on and says, "I'm going to educate you, Bart." That's my super objective in the third act, is to teach you. And when you said, "Oh, people don't normally say that," but in musical theater, sometimes they do. They come right out and sing their "I Want" song. But I'm curious to know how it evolved over the course of the writing of the third act.
I wish I could tell you. I can't, because it took place over like a couple of weeks.
Right.
Quite honestly, the first rehearsal process in DC was harrowing for everyone involved, because I mostly haven't written plays that had music, and certainly nothing where music was intrinsic. So right. You write a scene, you ask actors to read it. You can't necessarily tell from a first reading if the scene works or not. Sometimes something can seem not to work, and then when you really get into rehearsal, it does, because everyone's sort of accounted for that. And sometimes something can work brilliantly when people read it, but when you sort of are up and, when it's full-bodied, it feels hollow. So that's the super annoying thing about theater, right? Like, it's a series of experiments. You're always sort of running to see what you have there, and it takes a while to figure it out. But with musical theater or anything involving music, everybody has to learn the music. The musicians have to learn the music, and then you get it all up, and then you work out if it may work brilliantly in that moment, but it may not set up the next moment. I mean, it's a lot of machinery and a lot of people's time and soul and patience. Yeah. And I think Michael would say that, it nearly killed both of us. It felt like it at the time, often. To get that third act into shape.
Well, tell me about, I was going to ask you about September 11th, because there's a particular lyric in the third act about two towers of light that I remember when I saw the play in its first production, or its New York production, thought, it felt, I guess maybe it was almost exactly a decade after September 11th, or the decade had recently passed, and it felt very, very present in that first production. And now the world having gone through this global trauma of the pandemic, and still kind of struggling to emerge from it, I wonder if you feel like how the play resonates as a kind of container for meaning is different now than it was when it first came into the world in 2012. I should say, for audiences that haven't yet seen the play, part of the backstory that leads to this collapse, and the first act is a certain number of weeks after that collapse, seems to hinge on some kind of a global pandemic that turns into a kind of nuclear catastrophe. Is that a fair summary? I've seen an earlier draft where you say the bug flew through this particular town, and later drafts that feel like they're less explicit about sickness or pandemic being the kind of the first domino that kind of falls. But it's hard not to read it that way after all of us living through a pandemic in the recent years.
Yeah, I mean, it's the plot hinges on it being a much more horrifying pandemic. I mean, nuclear power plants take a lot of personnel to maintain safely. Chemical plants require a lot of personnel to maintain safely. So I think there was this notion of what happens if you lose personnel pretty rapidly. And we're not really set up for that right now. So I think that was kind of the spur, the sort of the spur and the backstory around that. And in terms of how it, I mean, I didn't think of it as a 9/11 play when I was writing it. It was sort of afterward looking at it, I was like, oh yeah, that would be a 9/11 play in some sort of covert way. I don't know how, I mean, in a weird way, I'm the last person to know how it resonates now. I mean, it feels to me like, oh yes, it feels to me like it has resonance. I don't know to what degree it does or doesn't. I will say that part of what was, and there's a little bit around this in the play, something I thought was really fascinating to watch in New York City after 9/11. The degree to which everyone was on the same page in certain ways, in the way we conducted ourselves around the event, just in the way it got talked about or didn't get talked about. Sort of when you met someone, you know, how much you talked about it, when you talked about other things, what the outreach about, it just like in an odd way, it's the etiquette around the event, but also the conduct. And normally in normal life, we're all sort of in our own slightly different worlds of conduct. You know, we're kind of asking, you know, so it was really interesting to see everyone behaving the same way, which I think has been, I mean, obviously we're very split in terms of how we respond to this pandemic on a number of levels, but there are some ways in which we're all behaving kind of the same way or having similar sets of responses. Everyone's circumstances are violently different, but I don't know. I just, being in New York City and watching the masking happen at the very beginning of it. You know, at first there were a couple of people who were masked and no one else. And then a couple more and no one else. And just the moment when it hit some sort of tipping point where everyone decided, no, masking is going to happen now. And then, you know, within hours, it felt like just the degree to which I became aware that we're tracking each other on a level, you don't think of yourself as tracking everyone else. Like that in danger, we become very acute to each other in a way that we don't need to be normally. And so it's just a set of muscles we don't normally exercise or feel the working of, I think. So there was something about going from being a person conducting their personal life to being part of a collective, which it felt like was the case after 9/11. And even the ways in which we're a jangled collective, where, you know, the arguments we have with each other around the pandemic are acutely pitched arguments because everybody cares a lot. Do you know, everyone's at least the same level in terms of the amount of octane they're bringing to it.
So the first act happens a certain number of weeks after this collapse. You know, maybe I think the first act is set in late September. Maybe the collapse was the previous spring or something like that. Does that feel roughly right? And you know, 6 or 7 people around a campfire. The second act happens 7 years later, and we're following mostly the same group of people with one significant addition, rehearsing a play. And the play is really, the script of the play is the same episode from The Simpsons that we were watching them struggle to remember in Act 1, you know? So if that group doesn't coalesce there, if they don't successfully uncover, you know, at least a majority of the dialogue from this beloved episode of The Simpsons, then 7 years later, they're not together, and their whole working and waking life is focused on performing episodes of The Simpsons, which they had no interest in, no qualifications for, no experience in before the first act. But really, we're watching a theater company in the second act rehearse And you wrote a whole nother play about the kind of camaraderie and the collaboration of making theater, a play called 10 out of 12. So it's something that you're connected to and that you've returned to. But I wonder, what's, you said the first version of the second act was just watching the show, but it's such a different second act when instead of watching the show, you're watching the making of the show. You're watching the power struggles and the discoveries and the disappointments and the, just the muddling through of making something. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, that kind of backstage drama, I guess is the word for it, in the broadest sense that you're writing towards in the second act.
I guess I just find it moving. The thing that, which I'm sure the thing that you run into when you're rehearsing it, is that everyone who's rehearsing, all the actors in the show are actors. So they kind of fall into the rhythm of what it is to be in rehearsal with other actors. And you kind of need to remind them that, because everybody's had a theater company that they, created out of college, and it lasted for a year and a half and then dissolved in, a fiery ball. Almost every sort of, theater productions rarely fall apart, but that's because the period of time we're working on them is short. It's such an incandescent task, and everybody's bringing themselves to it. Collaboration is really, really hard. So you sort of need to remind them that in the normal course of things, probably they all would have split apart as a theater company years previous. And the reason they haven't is because it's their only ticket to survival. So it's kind of like making a show, and it's high, shows always feel very high stakes, and they are, but yeah, the stakes are incredibly high. Like, it's in a weird way an entirely different thing, because you just kind of can't walk out. You can't storm off. I mean, you can, but you have to come back, and you have to figure a way to make it work. So, I guess I'm interested in collaboration and how difficult it is, and what it takes to make that work, or what it is to find ourselves in the middle of that really difficult task.
Yeah, great. Let's see, what else do I have for you? And the second act is set, this is a selfish question for me, the second act is set in a completely different part of the country. It's set maybe in Oklahoma or Kansas or someplace like that. Mm-hmm. How did you hit upon that idea? We were just talking about it in a design meeting the other day, and I was like, oh, I should ask Anne, why the second act is set in Oklahoma?
I'm gonna do that jerk playwright maneuver and say that it's important, but not say why.
Okay. I just thought the first act is in fall, and it's in the Hudson Valley, and they're huddled around the fire for comfort, but also maybe for warmth and safety. And the second act has this hotter, dustier, like we're carrying all our props around on horses in the middle of some kind of hot, barren landscape, dragging it from town to town. In contrast to the third act, where I felt it was really important that the show is no longer traveling. Mm-hmm. The audience is coming to where the show is, like whether it's inside, as one stage direction suggests, or in a architectural theater that's outside, not unlike our theater, or open air at least. It feels like people come there maybe from long distances to see this kind of ritualized story of The Simpsons and of kind of Bart's survival and resilience and ultimately triumph, which sets it apart from the second act, which has a very kind of DIY aesthetic, and everything is, they're carrying it around basically on their backs or in a wagon.
Yeah. Yeah.
You think that's right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I've just been kind of instinctively honed in on, and we're really now just talking as if no one's watching this Zoom, is I feel like the third act. I said to the design team, for the play to really pay off emotionally, I want us to have permission to make the third act beautiful in whatever way that means. Like, why it's not 20 years after the fall, it's 75 years after the fall, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't have invested what resources they have and developed expertise to make it wonderful, and because we're not following the same characters anymore, and the whole play seems to be about the kind of triumph of art over death. The third act has to be wonderful and therefore beautiful to us,
I think that's totally right. Yeah. It means a lot to them, and they put time into that. And that's ideally what beauty is. A lot of it is care, right?
Yeah, it's love. Yeah. Well, I know we have a bunch of people watching on YouTube. So as we're kind of coming to the end of our time with Anne, I want to just invite anybody who has a question. You can put it into the chat. We'll just keep talking. But Emily is doing such a great job. Oh, here's one. I'm going to read it to you, Anne. Pat King says, "Who do you imagine the audience is or would be for the play in the second act?" That's a really great question, and maybe in contrast to the audience for the play in the third act.
Oh, I mean, I think the audience for the play in the second act, I think it would be everyone or anyone. I think people would be bored, or not bored, but I think it's the second act. It seems like there's kind of a survival grind. I said it 7 years later. I had done like that's when regular batteries are gone, only lithium batteries still work. That's when sort of the easy cache of leftover food and clothing and stuff would either have like expired or rotted or gone up in flames or been used, so that it's sort of a kind of a desperate world in the second act. So I guess I assume it would be tons of people who would need a distraction. It might be more adults. It might be that maybe performances get sort of unruly, so that I feel in the third act, to me, it feels like it would be the audience. It's like a cross between Christmas Carol and a Greek play. That would be more like the city comes to, or the settlement, everybody, and I think I like your idea of people coming from far away. It seems like something that the whole family would go to and generations would go to, and maybe second act is a little bit more like theater in a bar. But most anybody who is willing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you, in one piece of writing you did about the play, maybe it's kind of note to prospective directors, you said the driving question should be, what would people be willing to give something of value, money or food or barter something in order to see, it's such a competitive economy that if they don't make a good show that people leave feeling like, oh, I would go to another show by that company.
Yeah.
They don't eat. It has to somehow provide something that audience values enough to come there and, give up something of value for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what about Mr. Burns and that particular figure in the third act? I'm so you've written about that character in particular. He doesn't really appear doesn't appear in the second act. That right at the end of the second act, which ends with a real shocking conclusion, Sideshow Bob is just kind of climbing up onto the boat. So for a play called Mr. Burns, finally the arrival of Mr. Burns in the third act feels like a really big deal. I wonder what you were trying to kind of tap into with Mr. Burns, why you called the play Mr. Burns.
I mean, the play was called Mr. Burns before they had picked the episode. So in the play, Sideshow Bob kind of morphs into Mr. Burns, who's the primary villain of The Simpsons, the sort of primary, I mean, I guess you could say figure of capitalism gone wild and gone wrong. He seemed for a couple of reasons to be a good figure, to be a figure who could encapsulate the fears of that time in the, I guess it's not 70s, it's, you know, almost 100 years in the future, that he would be, I guess I don't want to, again, I'm going to sort of do the jerk playwriting thing of, I don't want to talk too much about his function as a symbol, but I think he represents, he's a figure through which you can explore several different kinds of tension that I don't think the world of Act 3, for all that I think it is a settled place and it's beautiful, so that means that they have a degree of peace or social control and leisure to make the thing. I don't think it's our world. We haven't come back to that. I think it's a place where some of the concerns that haunt Act 1 and Act 2 are still part of that world. And I think that in that figure, that's a way in which people can think about it without having to think about it directly.
Yeah, and that anybody who was alive at the moment of the collapse would have been a child then. You know, it's almost as far, you know, in the past as World War II and the Holocaust is to us in 2022.
Yeah.
So that puts a frame that you're like, oh, that's the number of generations or just the number of years that history and memory would have kind of refracted that story.
Yeah, you have some number of very old people in the audience who were, you know, 10 or 11 when everything, so some number of people left. The number of people left who have any real sense of how the old world worked is all but gone. It's really dwindled.
Mm-hmm. So my last question is one that, you know, because we're the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival and we're producing your play in rep with incredible new play by Madeline Sayette called Where We Belong, and a Shakespeare play, Romeo and Juliet. All three plays are kind of about stories and generations and, you know, stories that have many fingerprints on them going back for sometimes centuries. I'm curious to know whether because I know you've also adapted the Greeks, whether part of what was on your mind is like, what kind of stories would survive? What makes a classic in quotation marks? Why does the story persist through time? I'm wondering if you have any perspective just to shed on that as it relates to, you know, the kind of Mr. Burns next to Shakespeare. I mean, there's a reference in Act 2 of like, you could go join one of the Shakespeares. So we kind of believe that there's a Shakespeare troupe out there taking Shakespeare around, but the difference between Shakespeare, which some people kind of think of as, you know, literary high culture, and The Simpsons, which is pop culture on TV, feels like it's somehow collapsed post collapse of you know, of civilization. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it sort of feels like in Act 2, at least, the Shakespeares are it's not great to be, like, that's the last rung before outright prosecution, honestly.
They're like, Maria, go join the Shakespeares if you want to do that. And she's like, no.
Yeah, which is it's not my personal feeling about, you know, which is more rewarding ultimately as literature. I mean, The Simpsons is pretty brilliant, but I'm not going to make a claim that it's part of wanting something I really envy with the Greeks, or am interested in as a reader and envy as a playwright, is that they would rework the same stories over and over, which meant that when an audience was coming to see it, they knew what the story was, so they were looking very attentively at how you were telling the story, like what's a different interpretation of events, or how are you seeing the character differently. Like the attention was very fine-grained because everyone had the same reference point and was very familiar with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was some of thinking like, oh, what it would be to take a story that everyone knew, that everyone could be thinking about in a different way as time passed, or just, you know, trying to channel that sort of form of attention. And then ultimately, I think we want to find stories that are important for us, and we will create that importance from whatever we have in hand. So so I think the question of literary value, although it's huge and is part of what we remember and what we love. I mean, there are those really moving stories of Greek soldiers who were captured in war and taken off as slaves to the quarries of whatever enemy nation, because at that point, when you were captured in war, if you weren't killed, you were sold, buying their way to freedom by being able to recite a couple of speeches of Euripides. You know, so valuable is that considered. I don't know that I'm answering your question. I think we find importance somewhere always, which doesn't mean that everything is equivalent in terms of, I don't know, how genius it is or how moving it is or whatever. But I think that we will always find a way to love and be moved by something.
I love that idea, and you're kind of blowing my mind that it's really the need that finds the impetus rather than the other way around. You know, yeah, I want to think more about that. And I'm so grateful to you for spending an hour with us on Wednesday after an afternoon full of talking and thinking about Club Thumb, a theater company that we both love a lot. And I'm also so grateful that you came up to see the new home of the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, and I'm really honored to have your play as part of our first season there. So I can't wait for you to, you know, come on up again while we're rehearsing it, and come and see the show this summer as much as you're interested or available to do so. We can't wait to welcome you back.
Well, the space is astonishing, and Davis, I've admired your work for 20 years, so I'm very excited to see.
Well, you're kind to say it. Thank you for spending the time with us. Everyone on the Zoom, this is the third of our Wednesdays with series. We're going to be doing more of them in the weeks to come. And tickets for Anne Washburn's brilliant play, Mr. Burns, a post-electric play, along with Where We Belong and Romeo and Juliet, will be going on sale very soon. I think for members, tickets will be on sale next week, and for the general public, the week following. So if you're not already a HVSF member, you can go to our website, hvshakespeare.org, and join there to get first dibs on the very best seats to see Anne's play this summer. I think we'll wrap up there, and thank you again for spending time with us. And I look forward to talking to you very soon. Thanks, everybody. Good night.